you as soon as you get back.
Okay, so I'd get some of the shade off my face.
Okay, so David Helvarg, author, longtime journalist, executive director of the ocean policy group Blue Frontier, and one-time winner of a Nesmia Herman Melville Award, will talk about public education for ocean climate action. And just to remind everyone, the Herman Melville Award is to a member or non-member who has made a major contribution to the world of maritime literature or art. He'll review how an ocean climate action plan helped add over 10 billion for coastal restoration, ports, and long ignored waterfront communities to recent climate legislation. But how greater emerging challenges will require a new approach that balances a sense of wonder and warning as we mobilize to protect our blue planet and those who depend on it, be they human or wild. So David has graciously donated 6 copies of his books, 3 of his books. They are Saved by the Sea, 50 Ways to Save the Ocean, and The War Against the Greens. And I brought with me some extra books of his to show, but apparently he has those lined up as well. So very quickly, we're going to run a pre-raffle, a quick raffle, and I'm going to pull out some numbers that you were assigned when you registered, and we'll get in touch with you and call you. So if you don't see me for a second, it's because I'm looking at the list. Although we don't know. Maybe you do see me. Okay, so the first number up, hold on one second, is number 9. And I'm gonna get back to the Zoom 1 second. Okay, just so that you could see it, number 9. And who is number 9? Okay, number 9 is Lou Siegel. Ah. Okay, the next one is number 5, and that is Adam Rebuff. The next one is number 6. That's me. I'm going to recuse myself. I already have your books, David. The next one is number 16. That's Francis Gary. Okay, so that's 3 so far. Next person is number 4. That's Maury Godwin. The next person is number 22, Anita Freudenthal. And then last person is number 11, Sally Wallinger. So if I can't find anybody to collect those books, then we'll just randomly assign a book to someone. So
I'd suggest to go to the people who actually show up.
Right. Right. Well, I see. Yes, I see. There she is. And
Yeah.
so we'll deal with that. But without any further ado, I would like to welcome David Helvarg.
Okay, and thank you, Lisa, and thanks everybody. Yeah, ocean climate. So the question that was also an article I wrote, recently, can the ocean save the Earth? And I guess the short answer is no, but we can't deal with climate unless we deal with ocean. 20 years ago, after my book Blue Frontier came out, and then I got a call out of the blue from Ralph Nader, who read the last chapter. It's called The Seaweed Rebellion. It's about marine grassroots activists who are providing solutions. The solutions just aren't at the scale that we need them. And so call them the Seaweed Rebels. Like I say, marine grassroots. He asked if anybody was really trying to organize, and essentially offered to help me set up a nonprofit, which became Blue Frontier, named after the book, because as an environmentalist, you want to recycle, of course. And now we've just here we are 20 years into Blue Frontier. There's our 20-year report. When we started out, I was looking at the cascading effects of ocean threats, which is industrial overfishing for the global seafood market, pollution, oil, chemical, plastic and nutrient pollution, loss of coastal habitat, unsound development along the world's coastlines, and climate change. And I think that over time, we've seen climate change kind of overwhelm other threats in terms of an existential threat to ocean health. And in part, this is because 90% of all the anthropogenic heat generated by the burning of fossil fuels is absorbed by the ocean. And as a result of that, if it weren't, our average temperature would be 122 degrees, 57 degrees warmer than it is surface temperature. So the ocean, which throughout history and geological time has been the driver of climate and weather, is now also the buffer of most of the climate forcing of the last 200 years, the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation of the planet that is a result of human activities, and particularly the Industrial Revolution. And so you have a situation where you're seeing not only overwhelming impacts at local and regional levels, systemic impacts to the habitats like coral reefs. I've now seen coral bleaching, coral disease and coral bleaching in Florida, in Hawaii, and Fiji, and Australia, and Cuba, and pretty much everywhere I go. I just finally took last year, one of the dream dives I've always planned to do to Rangiroa and Fakarava in French Polynesia, and very pristine reefs. So there's these channels where the tidal shifts bring in all the big pelagics, and so you see the mantas and the tuna and wild dolphin and sharks in great abundance. That's what I call shark enhanced, not infested waters, where you're traveling, there's hundreds of sharks coming through the channel. At one point we look out and there's a big, like 15, 16 foot hammerhead in the distance, and suddenly all the small 4 to 8 foot sharks, the black tips and reef sharks, all panic and swarm up on the reef with us to get away. And it's those kind of moments of wonder that engage us all. It's like we're trying to protect what we love. Number one in my 50 ways to save the ocean is go to the beach, just for that reason, that this is where we connect with the greater part of our planet. That is, as I say, the driver of climate, but now also the victim of anthropogenic climate change. So we've seen, and even there in Fakarava, where there are less than 1,000 people on a 30 by 20 mile atoll, and there's no significant fishing, no significant pollution. And even there, we saw about a quarter of the reef impacted, where we've seen, bleached and dead reef as a result of a global phenomena. Basically, bleaching is, again, where we have warming water, and in that situation, the algae on the surface of the living coral gets expelled, and since they, the polyps, the actual living coral cells, are getting about 30% of the nutrients, grabbing them from the surrounding waters, and then the algae, which gives the coral its colors, kind of farming about 70% of nutrients. So when they're expelled in hotter water conditions, the reef starts slowly, they turn wedding cake white and slowly start starving. And if the heat stays too long, you have dead coral. There's recovery, but when I was in Australia, the scientists were saying a year out, you only have 40% of the reproduction. It takes about 3 years to get back to normal reproduction. And then with more frequent warming, more frequent marine heat waves, you have increased risk of coral loss. Same thing's happening here in California. I recently did a New York Times piece on the other forest disaster that's taking place off our shores, where 90%, 95% of the kelp forest north of the Golden Gate has gone away in the last few years. Basically, it's kind of, again, a cascading effects of climate. First, we had what we call the blob, this marine heat wave, and kelp, which is, kelp is the new coral. Kelp is this incredibly biodiverse habitat. The only other place I really want to dive other than coral reefs is, put on all my cold water diving gear and get in there into the, the Sherwood forest of life. But it likes cold, nutrient rich waters. And when the water is warm, the kelp starts breaking up, the holdfasts start weakening. And then at the same time, you had this disease, the sea star wasting disease. And even though the scientists don't know the exact methodology yet, even whether it's a virus, bacteria, but they do know that warmer waters supercharge that disease. That disease took out all the dandelion sea stars, which were the main predator left for purple urchin, these little urchins, because the otters are gone from most of the California coast, and the giant lobsters and black sea bass that used to be top predators. So the sea stars are the last predators on the purple urchins, which are too small for the commercial urchin harvest. So they came out of their cubby holes where they used to just grab pieces of drifting kelp, and they just took out all the holdfasts that were left, took out the forest where now there are urchin barrens where there used to be healthy kelp forest. So we're seeing these cascading disasters. What do we do about it? Part of it is, and this is more my frustration. I'm more frustrated than despairing because we know what most of the solutions are. It's creating the political will to enact them. We know that we have to do a quick transition off of fossil fuels. And the good news is that in the last decade, we've seen that the renewables, wind turbines and photovoltaics, solar and wind are now commercially cheaper than any of the fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas. In fact, there on the East Coast, you even have rapid expansion. They're putting a lot of steel in the water, and it's happening fast, and there's a lot of controversy around it. But the reality is you're seeing a shift from basically energy generated with fossil fuels in the Gulf to what's going to be the main energy, offshore energy, wind off the eastern seaboard, where you have a shallow continental shelf, and close by markets. And so between New England and North Carolina, you're going to see a huge amount of offshore wind go in. Here in California, we're talking about floating wind, like spar systems that cable down to the bottom because we have a steeper continental shelf. But the reality is that this transition, the energy transition, is real, despite the political opposition of what has until recently been the largest industrial combine in human history, the oil and gas industry, and it hasn't gone away. I mean, Exxon made $57 billion of profits last year in the midst of situations. So in terms of like our immediate situation here, say from the Golden Gate up to the Oregon border, people they're going into the water. Urchin fishermen are like sucking the purple urchins out with suction systems. Now they're using hammers to smash them. They're trying to create open spaces of several acres, some coves, and reseed. Other people are looking to take the purple urchin and put them into our, humans are very good at consuming problems. So we're eating lionfish, and out here they're looking at fattening up the zombie urchins and starting to bring them into our restaurant trade. But the reality, a friend who manages the Humboldt State Marine Lab up in Trinidad, California, is we're back in a cold water regime. And I was just up in Fort Bragg, where all the fishermen and tourist industry are kind of pounded by this. There's an annual abalone recreational dive industry that brought 40 million a year into the area, and that's not happening because without kelp, there's no abalone. So they were saying maybe 10 years, they're hoping it'll come back through both efforts to, human efforts to expedite the process, but also just the natural restoration of our upwelling cold water systems. So how do we accelerate all of this? Well, so in 2019, the Green New Deal came out, to a lot of fanfare. And at that point, I read through it and realized there was like no blue in the Green New Deal. So Blue Frontier partnered with the Center for the Blue Economy at the Middlebury Institute down in Monterey. And we started working on an ocean climate action plan. First, we brought 60 Californians together to talk at the local level. Then we went national, started building a coalition that ranged from, former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta to Jane Fonda, and lots of grassroots and environmental justice folks in between, and built up a coalition of several hundred ocean leaders, started campaigning. We have 4 basic areas that were finally agreed on in 2020 when our Blue New Deal, our Ocean Climate Action Plan, came out: coastal adaptation and financing, clean ocean energy, port shipping in the maritime sector, sustainable fisheries, aquaculture, and marine biodiversity conservation. And a lot of these, I won't go through all of them, but just, well, since we were talking about clean ocean energy, I remember when the Biden administration came in and President Biden said, and we're going to double our offshore wind. So we wrote some pieces going like, yeah, that's useless because the European Union already has 30 gigawatts of offshore wind power. And at that point, we had like less than 1%, less than 1 gigawatt, significantly less. So basically push that out. And eventually the administration is now promoting 230 by 30s. And it's funny, I was talking to the head of NOAA on my podcast, and he was going like, yeah, 30 by 30, it depends what audience I'm talking to. Some think it's 30% of the land and water being protected by 2030. Others think it's 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. It's an ambitious goal, but I think it can be realized. And by the time the US has 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in 2030, the EU will have 60. So we're still behind the curve, but at least we're in the right competition, the competition for rapid transition off fossils and onto sustainable forms of energy. Now, the problem is, and we brought like 800 people to seminars. It was still COVID, and so we couldn't lobby in DC. So we had a virtual lobby with 300 folks from 30 states talking to lots of senators and Congress people pushing what was then called Build Back Better. And Joe Manchin said no. And at a certain point, when I wrote my piece, Can the Ocean Save the Planet? I was talking to a Congressman Jared Huffman here in California. Said, well, we're just one senator away from getting this done. And I kind of rolled my eyes. But in the end, that senator came on board and we got the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which is actually a climate bill that puts $300 billion a start. It's a great bill for 1989. And unfortunately, it's two things. First of all, it's the most significant climate bill, certainly in US history. And it brings us back into the game after years in which, essentially the Trump administration was the big oil administration, among other things. So it's significant. And within that, was it 369 billion? There's at least 10 billion we helped get dedicated to coastal restoration and decarbonizing ports and shipping. And now a lot of what we'll be doing, working with different folks to make sure that essentially do what I always did as a journalist, which is tracking waste, fraud, and abuse, make sure that those dollars that are now going into the agencies track out to the frontline communities in need. You look at something like, and if that happens, that's a significant step forward. Now, again, I wrote a piece, on the Clinton Gore administration's failure to act on climate change. So as I say, it's sort of both an acknowledgement that things have to be done and an acknowledgement of our failure, because the 2015 Paris agreements, the 2021 Glasgow Accords, both commit to taking temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, no more than that. That's the difference between dangerous and catastrophic climate change. The reality is that's not possible with the amount of heat we already put in the system. And so we're going to have to find ways to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so, this is the IRA bill, the climate elements of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, great starting points. And yet we're not going to see the results in our lifetimes. We're going to be looking at the next century as a period of eco restoration, and maybe in the 2022s will be the 22nd century. We may see temperatures coming back down. Ironically, the most hopeful analysis of how we get there is a science fiction book. We've had Stan on our Rising Tide Ocean podcast. Kim Stanley Robinson wrote The Ministry for the Future. And it starts with catastrophe and then shows how we can still work our way out of it. And I think that's sort of the story of the ocean as well. We're, in a catastrophic state now. We talk about blue carbon. One of the solutions for coastal restoration is expansion of blue carbon, which is really just saying expansion of living shorelines. Only now we're coming to recognize that those dunes and eelgrass beds, the seagrasses and the mangroves and the kelp forests are not just wonderful habitats and nurseries for the ocean and filters of pollution and rechargers of our aquifer, but they're also effective for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. That in fact, mangroves and kelp are about, we're working on a documentary, Sequoias of the Sea, and kelp's more effective than redwoods in sequestering carbon. Mangroves are more effective than rainforests. And yet we're losing them to development, unsound development, and all of that. And all of that is also part of that balance we have to achieve between the economy, the environment, and equity. I mean, one of our Blue Frontier projects for 17 years now is here in Richmond, California, where I live. And it's to save a 420-acre headland, Point Mulati. And we've been fighting for years since I moved here 17 years ago. First, it was going to be a mega casino that they were going to build there. We took that to a vote, community that's predominantly low-income community of color. So they were offering jobs. You can all be like maids and security guards. We took it to vote, and the city voted it down like 58 to 42%. So the failed casino developer kept suing. He didn't get his own business model. When you gamble, you lose most of the time. And then we got a new mayor who is a developer himself, who wants to develop this biodiverse headland that includes 120 acres of the most pristine eelgrass beds on San Francisco Bay. And so since 2016, we've been battling their attempt to sell it off to a Southern California developer for luxury housing. But we've mobilized the community. We've got, the Hispanic youth soccer leagues and the Black Bike Co-op and the Richmond Powwow and all of the communities, and now a majority of the city council on board for a park. The plan to float a $300 million bond to provide the infrastructure for the luxury housing was voted down. And we got the state of California to commit $36 million for the acquisition and development of Point Mulati and the eelgrass as a natural park. So we're, with our ospreys and our, river otters eating the leopard sharks in sight of the kids on the shore, we've got the possibility. And it's just been an incredible battle. And these are the incredible battles that have to take place, from the bottom up to get change from the top down. I mean, it goes back to when I covered many of these same issues at the 1992 Earth Summit. I was doing a documentary, Green for Life, and one night there was a big march, and 30,000 people from the favelas and from international environmental groups that were there, led by a banner of Buddhists with cell phones, which was quite an invention back then. Big banner said, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. So if we go back to what's coming out of the bill, it's the decarbonizing ports and shipping. Well, the greening ports movement really started here in California, started in Los Angeles when low-income fence line communities, the San Pedro Port Complex, the largest in the Western Hemisphere. It's the ports of LA and Long Beach. And when you go there, it's like the land of giants. 4 a.m, I was getting off a pilot boat and climbing up the Jacob's ladder onto a Maersk ship coming in from Japan. And, it's just everything's out of scale. And $1 billion a day of goods cross those docks. But a decade ago, Maersk and the other shipping companies, couldn't expand their terminals because the low-income communities, the fence line communities of San Pedro and Wilmington and Long Beach, were suing because they had the highest rates of childhood asthma, the highest rates of adult cancer, because of the incredible pollution coming off the port from the trucking, from the ships. And so they hired a new director for the Port of LA, and Geraldine Natz was not only the first biologist, but the first woman to run a major port. She got together the port commissions of LA and Long Beach for the first time since 1924, even though when you're there, you can't tell where one ends and the other begins, but very competitive. She got a clean air action plan. Within 6 years, 70% of the air pollution was gone. They got rid of all the diesel burning trucking and replaced it with cleaner trucks and transport. They did what they call cold ironing. They brought electrification to the dock, so the ships plugged in there instead of burning bunker fuel in the port, which is like the dregs of diesel. And it became a model. And now, we're talking about electrifying all the ports, and the port of San Diego is installing eco-concrete on its seawall that attracts biological life and diversity, and also, putting reef balls in the South Bay to attract, coral oyster reefs to act as a buffer against sea level rise there, and growing out, restoring wetlands in the South Bay. And so from, the challenges of people know how to build hard infrastructure, but, we don't have the Army Corps standards or what have you for living shorelines. And yet that's what we need. We need to create the living shorelines. We need to create new incentives for people to relocate. We need federal standards for relocation. We need to use this initial funding to do the things that work for the frontline communities most at risk. And that's, that's both a challenge and an opportunity. And once they started to clean up the port of LA, lawsuits went away. The terminals expanded, which had been in abeyance. And again, this is like the classic example with $1 billion a day of goods crossing those docks. Classic example when you do good by the marine environment, you do good by the economy. I still think that California is a good example. 40 million people, the world's 5th largest economy. We do good by our coast and ocean. And part of that I also see is because we don't have a single industry or special interest dominating our coastal waters. You go to New England, you see the politicians think the fishermen own the ocean, and that's why there's no cod off Cape Cod anymore. You get down to Florida, and Florida is like the California Doppelganger. It's like how to do it all wrong when you just listen to the developers in big ag. That's how you get your red tides and your urban seawalls. And of course, the Gulf, Louisiana is a contradiction. It's an oil colony, and yet it's already committed, to a $50 billion program. And it's the model of how we do coastal restoration, because they realize what they're losing. It's not just the extinction of clams, but Cajuns. Whole cultures are being washed away in the rising seas. And so, ironically, the most oiled part of the country is also becoming a model for how we start the major investments. And believe me, 360 billion is only the start. That's the equivalent of what we lose to climate-related extreme weather disasters on a regular basis. NOAA's tracking how many $1 billion extreme weather events happen, and a lot. And again, we're investing, this 360 billion over a decade, whereas it's still less than half of what we're investing per year in the Pentagon. So I also look for, deep pockets, and I've argued that we need to create a 13th war fighting division within the Department of Defense for disaster response. Right now, all disaster response is based in the Northern Command, which basically is NORAD. I mean, their historic job is to wait for Russian missiles to come over the Arctic. They're not very good at responding to on the ground disasters, like we just saw with our recent atmospheric rivers here in California. I mean, but the Federal National Guard is contained within the DoD. They have the resources, they have the losses that they've experienced themselves. Billions of dollars of planes destroyed in one hurricane in Florida because they didn't move them out of the way. The Coast Guard's very good at taking its assets, moving them out of the way of hurricanes and then surging them back in to do search and rescue in the immediate wake. It's the only one of the armed forces not located within the Department of Defense, but it could be part of nonetheless, it could be part of a disaster response command, because it's the one armed force that's dedicated to disaster response, among its many other maritime functions like ports and aids to navigation. So as I say, we know what the solutions are. It's scaling them. I mean, when Geraldine Natz left port directorship in LA, she started work on and became president for a time of the International Association of Ports and Harbors. And so 50 of the largest ports in the world now have an incentive program where shipping that comes into their ports, if their propulsion is cleaner than the IMO, the International Maritime Organization standards, they get a 15% deduction on their dockage fees. And when you have, a container ship with like 15,000 TEUs, 15,000 containers on it, you're saving 100, 150,000 every time you come into port. That creates real economic incentives to start cleaning up, as Maersk and the shipping industry is suddenly realizing that they can't put it off till the end of the century. They have to decarbonize shipping by 2050, but they don't know what fuel they'll use yet. I mean, they're just starting to build dual use ships that it could be, wood alcohol, it could be hydrogen, it could be small nukes. They don't know, but supposed to be halfway there by 2030. So they got 7 years to figure out what they'll be using and have ships that can, use both fossil and alternative liquid fuels. And again, they're behind the 8 ball because the IMO was too beholden as a UN agency to the industry it was supposed to regulate. Anyway, those are just some of the challenges. We're going to follow up with this initial funding. We're not going to get anything new in the next 2 years, except a clown show in the House. But while we're watching that clown show, we'll also be seeing billions of dollars going to frontline communities, to our coast. We're going to see tens of thousands of new jobs in clean energy. We're going to be seeing if rural America really responds to actual incentives when they're wired up and when jobs come to the center of the country. And you're seeing, places like I say, where some of the offshore wind in northern New Jersey, power cables are going to come up and power distributed from an old coal-fired power plant. So we're in this transition moment, but we need to do a lot more, and we need to basically inspire a generation to do the work that needs to be done, which is, I think, the next human enterprise is ecosystem restoration. Scaling it up is the challenge. Right now, I went to a conference with 600 coral restoration folks meeting, and on the second day of the conference, they were disrupted by a hurricane. So we got to rebuild out of disaster. I think that, and it's costing like a couple $100 to cement some coral onto a reef. We got to scale it up to where it's like reforestation, where you can train some high school kids and have seedlings for 50 cents a seedling and get a couple of million out of there. And interestingly, you'll see, if you look for where it's working, it's places you don't expect. Pakistan is upscaling its mangrove forests at a level, millions, literally millions of acres that have been restored. And then a third of their country was underwater because of flooding disasters this year, which turned them into the progressive leaders at the last climate summit of saying that, the developed world that's benefited from 200 years of fossil energy has to start spending money for the transition, for adaptation and disaster response for the developing world that hasn't experienced this. And so my last article with the Center for Blue Economy was, now we've got a legislative start. What are the other challenges? It's going to be convincing people that it's not only just, but it's a survival strategy to start transferring wealth over to those most in need of, most impacted by climate in the coastal regions of the world and most in need of support for the transition. And in the interim, we're facing, the right wing's very, very much taking advantage of migration and refugees who are growing in huge numbers. A lot of them are climate refugees. A lot of the Central Americans coming to the US, for example, because of the rules, they can only claim asylum status if they're victims of violence, of war and gangs. They can't say that they haven't been able to farm coffee for 5 years because of a drought, or that, that the hurricanes that have pounded the Honduran and Nicaraguan coast of the last years drove them from their homes. So at least half these people are effective climate refugees, and you're going to have millions more, 50 million by projected by in the later decades of the first half of the century. So the challenges are huge. I'm pitching some books now. I thought one of my books, Saved by the Sea, kind of traumas me and the ocean have shared over the last 50 years. I thought maybe I'd just finish up by reading from that, and then we got a good 20 minutes for a Q&A, because I think that's the most interesting. So I'll just take it from the end. I was not born for peaceful times or calm waters, nor have I seen many. We're living in the age of global markets and mass extinctions, birth of celebrity websites, YouTube and Twitter, death of sharks, sea turtles, and others of our planetary brethren, who were already ancient when the first small mammals left their dirt-filled burrows. Well, I've gone from radical activist to war reporter, private investigator, TV producer, author, and activist again. I do so with a more sober assessment than when I was young, running wild in the streets, chanting "Power to the People," a slogan later appropriated for battery-powered Oral-B toothbrush ad. Today, I don't really expect a revolution in either politics or consciousness to radically alter the cascading ecological collapse of our ocean. I do, however, note a rising tide of ecological mindfulness approaching the declining plane of biological diversity on our water world. Where that X crosses, which I think is right now, will tell us how much is left to save and restore if we can. I'm not sure it'll be enough to turn the tide. All I know for certain is that if we don't try, we lose. And this salty blue world of ours is too heart-achingly beautiful, scary, and sacred to lose. If you don't believe me, join the space program, travel out into the cosmos, look back from the heavens. It's not God's green earth, it's God's blue marble. So thank you, and let's talk.
Thank you, David. Thank you. That was so insightful, and it's mind-blowing how you pull in from so many different areas and make coherent thoughts, simple, coherent thoughts out of what's a very complex thing to understand these days. I wanted to ask a question about the electrification of the ports, because I don't know anything about this, and I don't have any way of hearing anything about this. So would you happen to know if the Elizabeth Port of New Jersey is on track or has already electrified, or anything about that?
I don't know about Elizabeth. Well, the Port of New York, New Jersey is on track. They're and a lot of one of the things I'm doing is just now starting to research the funding, which I believe will go through DOT and the Maritime Administration to help ports that don't have the funding to do this. Basically, once we electrify the ports and once we have green energy sources, we drop the carbon density, which also drops the, community small particle pollution significantly. Haven't followed New York, New Jersey for a while. I know that one of the people I'm going to work with, NMEPA, is it's kind of like the green wing of the maritime industry. I mean, they have some issues, but they're close to a lot of these issues, and so we're going to try and bring them in. And in terms of ports and shipping, some of the NGOs are finally getting on board. Pacific Environment, Ocean Conservancy, Friends of the Earth all have people dedicated to what I wrote a Ports of Call chapter in my Golden Shore book. It's kind of like, how do you not think about where we get 90% of all the stuff we get comes off ships? But people don't.
I caught a piece on TV this evening about coral reefs off of Florida and how they're being devastated right now. And what they're doing, or what maybe a university is doing, is to take the best samples that haven't been attacked yet and put them into a closed aquaculture situation at a college. I think it's at a college or a university, and try to grow as much as possible. These are adults doing this, trying to grow as much as possible, then to reseed the ocean somewhere, if they even have as much as they would possibly need to do that. But it's not an unknown situation. It's been going on for decades, but something is accelerating the corals off of the coast of Florida, and so it made the news.
Yeah, the latest is stony coral tissue disease, and that's exploded out of Florida. We just in the episode now on our Rising Tide Ocean podcast, we interview Francis, who's the director of the Roatan Marine Park down in Roatan, Honduras, and it's spread down to her reef line, the Mesoamerican. She's literally has 50 volunteer divers who go out there. If you don't believe corals are living creatures, they're going out there with antibiotics, anticillin, in a paste and pasting it onto the lesions on the corals. And because the lesions appear and some of these corals die within 24 hours, but when they're putting on the antibiotic paste, it seems to protect the corals. So everything from hand dabbing antibiotics onto the reefs to taking tissue samples, growing corals. There's a coral farm in Florida that's 4 acres of coral pieces, which they're then going out and resetting, trying to regrow. They're analyzing they're doing genomic studies on corals to see, like I did a piece called like Rage Against the Dying of the Reefs. And I talked to my friend Steve Palumbi, who runs the Stanford, the marine lab down in Monterey. And I said, 65% of the corals where I went with my late love off of the Great Barrier Reef, that's 65% died. And his response was, well, I'm interested in the 35% that didn't, because a lot of them are the same species and they have greater resiliency to warming waters. And so they're doing a lot of genetic studies to identify what species work. During the recent hurricane, when it was down in Florida, I was doing a media training at that reef conference, and then I went on and met some local reef activists who had, I forget, was it Hurricane Irwin? No, not Irwin, but the most recent one. Anyway, when it was headed initially, before it veered south, it was headed for St. Pete, Tampa, which would have been a much larger scale disaster than the one that happened. So she had gotten a box cut, driven up to the Florida Aquarium, loaded a couple of their pillar corals, and showed me in her warehouse where the Florida Aquarium pillar corals were taking refuge. And of course, as a media guy, I immediately said, well, okay, as soon as you return them to the aquarium, you and the aquarium have to put out a big press release about storm refugees returning home.
That's nice. That's really nice. I want to encourage other people here in the group to ask David any questions or provide any thoughts that you might have. It's an open forum, and we really we look forward to hearing from you as well.
Hi, David. My name is Anthony Graziano. I'm a marine science teacher at Mepham High School in Belmore. I wanted to talk to you, wanted to know if you had any insight on ocean acidification. I read up on that a little bit, and what are your experiences with that?
Yeah, that's I think you should for your class, a great way to teach ocean acidification is bring in a shellfish farmer. The shellfish industry is really the indicator species for ocean acidification, because what it is, and again, we're discovering these disasters even as we're causing them. I mean, 20 years ago, nobody was talking about it. And now we're, the oceans shifted more acidic than it's been in 3 million years. And it localizes in certain cold coastal waters more rapidly. So the basics is, as I say, the ocean's absorbing a lot of our carbon dioxide, but it turns it into carbonic acid, which shifts the pH in the ocean, which is not good news for all the shell forming critters in the ocean, from little copepods up to, oysters and lobsters. And so I think a good way to teach it is through the industry that's being impacted. I mean, they were discovering that the spat, the baby oysters, they were growing off of Washington State and here in Hog Island oysters I work with there in Limitar off of Point Reyes, and a lot of the industries having to grow their spat in tanks on shore, or having to buffer their local waters as they monitor them, meaning literally it's like, throwing Tums in the water, adding alkali to balance the increased acidity. And at a global level, there've been a lot of experiments going on out of MBARI, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and others, trying to figure out what it's going to look like in 20 years and 50 years. But it's not going to look good. We're losing a lot of, the shell forming critters, zooplankton that are at the bottom of the food web are being distorted by, and corals too. I mean, if bleaching's not enough, it's the restoration. They grab the calcium carbonate out of the seawater. Is less there, means growth rates have been slowed 15 to 30%. So it's it's basic chemistry, of course. So is global warming, but you've got big industries denying basic chemistry. But I do think that especially like progressive aquaculturalists like Green Wave on Long Island Sound, that are doing combined kelp and shellfish farming, good folks to bring in, and they can make it real for students, that it's not just something happening in the chemistry of the ocean, something impacting people's lives and livelihoods.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm taking a course, a Green Wave course in marine algae farming, because that's what I think I'm interested in. But I'm not like a fisherman who is sort of trading out of the fisheries market, going out on a vessel and bringing back lobster or whatever, and now they're moving off into, some of them are moving off into the marine algae farming, but it has such a short season. The equipment is tricky, and keeping the equipment in place is tricky, and then getting it to the right market is also a challenge. So it's like a whole new world. Like we're being pushed into harvesting other resources at this point, rather than, I mean, I think that's great that this is coming, this particular resource is coming to the fore, but I don't think it's great that we're not doing anything about the other resources that we've practically destroyed. So it's a battle, it's a challenge. You know, I was listening to your talk about following the money, you know, where the money is going to actually make systemic change wherever. And even though we on the ground, you know, are trying to do things ourselves, it's going to take more influence, more power, more money at the top, I think. And I don't know as much as you know about all of this, but it seems that it would have to come from the top in order to move citizens, North American citizens, into seeing what's in front of them, what's happening to the oceans, and connecting them to the ocean so that they feel like they need to make a change somehow.
We got to get the Kardashians to start eating sea grapes instead of caviar. I mean, all tastes the same to me. It's salty, small, and poppy. Pops in your mouth. So yeah, I mean, you know, we're a celebrity culture, and that also drives things. And we're, you know, civil society is not what it was, but you know, the financial sector is definitely into green energy because it's a new place to make money. And you know, we just can't we can't leave the solutions up to the tech boys in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
But you know, it's not, I'm not hopeful or pessimistic. I'm just into triage. You know, we save what we can while we can. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity within that parameter. And I think, let me make a plug, because pretty much all of these topics we're now doing our 76th interview for our Rising Tide Ocean podcast. So lots of people that you can hear, the head of NOAA, the Undersecretary of State for Oceans, surfers, artists, and the like. So another educational resource.
How do I get to hear this podcast? What is the actual title?
It's titled, it's the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast. You know, Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you download your podcasts. And we just started getting it onto a few community radio stations as well in California and Colorado. So
That's great. That's
and
great. I also want to put, they're kind of dated, but I do want to put a plug in for your other books here, Dispatches from America's Oceans Wilderness, and of course the Blue Frontier, Saving America's Living Seas. Love that. And
yeah, it's out of print, but it's available online. Blue Frontier, Rescue Warriors. If you like the Coasties, but not sure why you like them, that's kind of my, you know, overview of, as I say, the only one of our armed services that saves more people than it kills. Saved by the Sea, War Against the Greens, 50 Ways to Save the Ocean, and my most optimistic, although maybe not so relevant to the New York chapter, is The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea.
yeah.
Although New York, Gotham, whales, I mean, New York's habitat's coming back too. You got sturgeons in the Hudson. Yee.
Well, Meryl could speak to that. Right, Meryl? Meryl, unmute. Meryl, unmute.
Yeah, in the past about 12 or 13 years ago, myself and Paul Seasward, who was the former curator of animals at the New York Aquarium, we noticed that there were suddenly whales creating a new feeding ground right off New York City, right off, Far Rockaway. Now the boat, American Princess, is docked in Sheepshead Bay. So right off our coastline, we have already identified, I think, about 266 individual humpback whales, and they have been coming back and returning in huge numbers. every year. So we
And
know
these
the
are my
water
native
quality-
waters. I
Yeah,
mean,
the
my
water
dad took
quality
me
is
fishing
great.
out of Sheep's Head.
Yeah, and I guess the success is not only the improved water quality, but also I think the Mid-Atlantic fisheries about maybe 10 years ago, which coincided with the whale more whale sightings, was the fact that the Mid-Atlantic fisheries did limit the taking of menhaden, and menhaden had been harvested in the same waters since the 1600s, not for a food source, but for commercial industry and the valuable oil derived from the menhaden. So the wildlife is great. It's coming back. I mean, it's really in abundance. The harbor seals and several populations of baleen whales. They're coming back, and I left New York.
Me too, but it's still good to see a healthy bay. And, I keep telling 80% of the city is not even connected to the mainland. I once spoke to a school group there in the city, and this fourth grader raises her hand. I go, "What is it, honey?" She's like, "Is that a real island?" I goes, "What a real island?" What you said Brooklyn and Queens was part of?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
the
what-
unfortunate thing was just the recent beaching of I think 10 whale mortalities have been counted so far in just a very short period of time. So we
What
have to
blows my
see.
mind is that they've not, I mean, any whale at beaches in California, pretty much one of the marine mammal centers is there with a necropsy immediately. And the state also supports that. And apparently, talking to people in New Jersey, there've not been necropsies on these beached whales. So you don't know if it's sound impact or, I mean, ship strike's pretty obvious, but the other potential,
Yeah.
I mean, you can talk about, is it the, surveys for the putting the steel in the water for the wind turbines? You don't know until you do
Yeah,
the
yeah.
necropsy. It's crazy.
Right, but it seems like the installation of these wind turbines might be the very culprit. But
Well,
that's yet to be determined.
they said that so far anyway, that this most recent whale beaching was because it was hit by a vessel.
I didn't. That was the one that was named Luna. It had been
Yes,
studied
yes,
for 40
yes.
years.
Yes,
Oh.
yes, they had been tracking it for a long time. But it's hard to say what the real answer is, because so many people, at least on TV, so many people seem reluctant to advance an answer, for fear that it might come down very negatively, and then it becomes politicized and you don't really get a straight answer after that. So you don't know who's controlling who. Is the wind industry controlling some legislative group out there on Long Island? Who knows? So, but at any rate, just want to ask if there are any more questions, or anybody would like to ask David anything at this time before we sign off. And I want to thank David. Thank you so much for giving your time this evening. It was so interesting. We hope to have you back again sometime in the future, and maybe after you publish this book that you're working on now, then you could talk about that. So, but at any rate, we do very much appreciate your being here for us and giving your talk for our speaker series. And we wish you well over there on the West Coast.
Well, thank you. And thanks for educating the next generation of watermen and women.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Bye.
Take care.